Just a quick note, in today's episode, there is discussion of suicide.
We are in a really good topic today. We're going to be talking about the pilot. As we've discussed in earlier episodes, the authorities very quickly became convinced that the plane most likely went south into the southern Indian Ocean, and that the only way that could really have happened is if one of the pilots basically stole their own plane. And there were two pilots in the cockpit, and one of them seemed much more suspicious than the other.
And I should point out that neither you nor I are psychologists, but we are going to talk nonetheless about these pilots and why they may or may not have been a likely suspect for this. So we have Zahari Ahmed Shah, who is the primary suspect, and he was a veteran pilot for Malaysia Air, right?
Yeah, very experienced guy, very well known within the company, very well liked within the company. But he was the main suspect primarily just because he was so experienced. You know, as we've talked about, there's a lot of reasons to think that whoever did this had a high level of technical knowledge, not only about how to fly a plane, but knowledgeable about how air traffic control worked and how the electrical system worked in a way that most captains don't.
When you say he had a ton of experience, like thousands of hours of flying, a long career, was he trained on other planes also, or was he just a hobbyist who just loved flying?
So he was such a fan of flying. He just loved flying airplanes to such an extent that he had this flight simulator, rather sophisticated flight simulator set up in his basement where he could go and just in his spare time when he wasn't flying real planes, pretend to fly computer simulation planes. And this becomes important. We'll get into it later. We might have to even do a whole separate episode about that flight simulator. It became a clue, a major piece of evidence for people to interpret.
We're foreshadowing a little bit, but being a pilot who has a flight simulator in their own house is not unique to Zahari. I mean,
No.
Pilots do this. I mean, this is a passionate career where people eat, sleep, and breathe flying. So we should point out that this is not,
I wouldn't say it's
completely unique to him.
It's not completely unique to him. It's not super common. I wouldn't say that every commercial pilot has a flight simulator in their basement, but people wind up becoming a commercial pilot because they do love to fly originally. Like, that's why they start, every pilot starts out flying a little plane first before they fly big planes. And so it is a kind of love for the sky that drives people. And for some pilots, I know they, on their weekends, they are glider pilots, or they, Les Abend, a 777 pilot who went on CNN with me a lot back in the early days of this mystery. I actually knew Les first because he was the tow pilot at a glider club that I belonged to.
Yeah, you're a pilot
so,
too, Jeff.
That kind of thing is not uncommon.
Yeah, let's remind people that you're a pilot here. So,
and I'm a pilot.
So you may not be flying 777s, but you know of what we speak.
I got my pilot's license in 2002. I was in my 30s, and I had some money came my way, and I had some time that came my way, and I was like, this is something I've always wanted to do, but I haven't had the time or the money, so I'm going to do it. So I learned to fly little Cessnas, and I really enjoyed that, and later I became a glider pilot. In my job as a writer and as an adventure writer, I would get opportunity to fly all kinds of different airplanes, which is really fun, from like Soviet-era fighter planes to Zeppelins to gyrocopters, all kinds of fun. So, yeah, a lot of people who are involved in aviation, it kind of gets under their skin, and they're just really are fascinated by many aspects of it.
Well, speaking of pilots, we also have the co-pilot, and that's something I wanted to talk a little bit about, because everybody is like, nope, wasn't that guy. Fariq Abdul Hamid. He was 27 years old. He was a very new co-pilot. He had just received his 777 certification, I think, to be a co-pilot.
Before he was able to fly by himself as a first officer, which is the technical word for what we generally call co-pilot, he's this sort of assistant, captain. But he had to fly 6 times with a Czech pilot who was there to make sure that he was going to be able to perform the basic functions of his role. And he had just finished his last one. So this was his first flight without this minder on hand. And actually, as we were getting ready for this episode, I was thinking, well, that's kind of an interesting... if you were of a mind to be suspicious of Fariq, you might think, well, finally he's free of the shackles of this babysitter. Maybe he's like, okay, now that I can be a co-pilot by myself, I'm going to steal the whole plane.
He did one weird thing, and that was, I believe, in 2011. He brought two women into the co-pilot or into the cockpit, smoking, hanging out, presumably being a cool guy. And they didn't know that at the time.
So post 9/11, this was a very bad thing to do. You did not want to bring strangers into the cockpit under any circumstances. This was very front of mind for pilots at the time. And so after MH370 disappeared, there was a lot of attention in the media to this story that he had brought women into the cockpit, presumably, as a way to show off to them out of romantic interest. Yeah. But that's it. I mean, he didn't seem like he would have the kind of technical chops to pull off something that was very aggressive and very sophisticated. Okay. But it's certainly not impossible.
Again, I'm not a forensic psychologist, nor am I a police officer, but I just find it a little strange that within a week they were like, nah, it wasn't that guy. It was probably Zahari. Did that strike you as strange?
No, you're right. And I think a lot of people who hew closely to the official consensus that the plane did go south into the Southern Ocean would probably hold him as a more likely culprit than kind of almost any other possible explanation. Like, ultimately, for this to be done the way it was, and remember, the plane, all of its electronics went dark within seconds of passing the last waypoint in Malaysian airspace, and very, very soon after that, the plane did this 180-degree turn, which again, this is what we're talking about: aggressive, decisive action. It had the perpetrator had to be in the cockpit, according to this view.
So they just think that to do something this sophisticated, you would have to be a very good pilot, and the main reason they ruled him out is that they didn't think he was good enough to do it.
He hasn't received 1/100th the scrutiny that Zahari did.
Because that's what I want to talk about here is the scrutiny that Zahari received.
Right.
I have some questions about it. First photos they showed of this guy, he looked pretty sinister. And there were like 2 photos shown of Zahari. And I thought, man, that is unfair. Like, in his entire life, he only has 2 photos. He looks like he's up to no good. But, we've all taken photos or had photos taken of us that are not like super flattering before. And in my research, I saw a lot of photos and some videos, and one of them we're going to watch together, where he looks like a super nice guy. Do you think that the media and Malaysia and whomever like seized upon some negative looking stuff to paint this guy as a potential murder-suicide pilot?
There were 2 major schools of thought that emerged very quickly about Zahari. And just to give a little context, this is a guy who was in his 50s. He had a wife. He had grown children. He had, as I say, been a stalwart at Malaysian Airlines for a long time, a senior captain. He was a comfortable, ensconced, lived in a fairly well-off suburb, had a nice house. And so he seemed like the very image of respectability, just on the sort of surface level. But if you looked at the data that this plane generated, it looked very much like somebody in the cockpit stole it and killed everyone on board, including himself. And so if you know that, when you look at pictures of him and you look at his YouTube page and you look at him on social media, you're looking at the pictures of a mass murderer.
Yes.
There's evidence that can be interpreted in various ways. Evidence in its by itself is ambiguous, but if you have already reached a conclusion, then this evidence is going to be read in a certain way. So the other major group of way that people looked at the Zahari evidence is that he was beloved by his community. He was spoken of fondly by his wife. His friends said he would never do anything like this. If you look at his social media, he looks absolutely benign. There's many pictures. There's a picture that was taken of him, which we can find and put up, of him looking absolutely relaxed. And he's got a sort of half smile on his face. He looks like someone who's just ultimately at peace with the world. Now, other people will look at this half smile and think, oh, that is a sinister villain's smile as he, sort of considers the evil he's about to do. So it's very hard to put a dispositive spin on any of this because that's just it. People see what they want to see.
The two schools of thought are interesting because there was a lot of talk about him being a creepy Facebook guy, that he was posting comments on this Malaysian model. I've seen a lot shadier things on Facebook than someone posting a picture of a fully clothed Facebook model and just saying, pretty.
Another thing that got a lot of attention was that he was a supporter of the pro-democracy movement. And the opposition leader who led this movement was jailed, was found guilty and imprisoned like the day that the plane disappeared. And again, if you are of a mind to see a terrorist or someone who is trying to cause mayhem because of their political beliefs, that would slot in there. Other people would say, who wouldn't be a pro-democracy activist? I mean, this guy ultimately did come to power, and he's a kind of a moderate Democrat, not an extremist. Zahari, by the way, was not a religious extremist. He was a normal kind of Muslim.
He was not to the best of our knowledge, he wasn't a fundamentalist. He didn't have radical tendencies.
Very few people are jihadists. Very few people want to go to heaven because they, died fighting.
And the
battle.
ones that do usually tell people about it. I mean, committing a terrorist act in complete anonymity, that doesn't really help an ideology.
Yeah, no, it definitely seems not to really fit together. Another issue psychologically about Zahari is the whole issue of committing suicide in this way. It struck me as a very strange way to commit suicide, to fly for hours and hours and hours. It seems like you're prolonging the worst part of it, which is if you're I think most people who are suicidal, and again, neither of us are a psychologist, but it just seems common sense that if your goal is to die, that's your goal. Your goal is not to prolong the strength of dying. The length of dying.
And that's not just an opinion that you came to on your own. You spoke to Catherine Ramslard, I believe. She is a forensic psychologist professor at DeSales University. And in an earlier interview you did with her, you asked her these specific questions. And again, you can't declare someone anything without speaking to them. So the best we have is his history. But she basically said, she agreed with you. She said most people don't just slowly ponder murder suicide and spend 6 hours, thinking about it. If it's not an impulsive decision, at least it's a planned decision, and it's the kind of thing that you do it and get it over with. They want to escape from something. And that's not consistent with someone who would have flown a plane for 6 hours slowly and then glided it or crashed it into the ocean without so much as a suicide note or a motive or anything.
So a couple of points. To address this issue of prolonging the horrible fate, some people propose that, well, maybe he turned the plane south and then took a poisonous pill of some kind or killed himself or shot himself, and then let the plane fly as a ghost plane into the Southern Ocean. And that does kind of, that would reconcile the part about prolonging the horrible part. But it doesn't seem like that's what happened.
Why?
It looks like, based on the evidence that we have, that somebody was in this plane actively at the controls, certainly active at the end, and manipulated the controls in a way we'll discuss further in future episodes. But this person didn't just take a cyanide pill and let the plane fly to the south. They were there the whole way. So the pilot suicide theory really necessitates active piloting for the 6 hours. And in terms of, it's not just that it was long, but it was complicated. The pilot suicide theory imagined that somebody was, remember, pulling circuit breakers, isolating circuits, flying over Air Force bases, being very evasive, flying really quickly, doing these complicated series of turns, not just crashing it into the plane. After my book about MH370 came out, Amazon asked me to do a Kindle single about Germanwings, which was a suicide that happened about a year later. He had actually been grounded for a while, and investigators found a search on his iPad where he'd been looking into pilot suicides. And one of the ones he looked at was MH370 because of the speculation about Zahari. So in the handful of cases we do know of, they all were troubled. They all had real red flags around them. Zahari had no obvious red flags.
Can I pause and ask you, because I hadn't even really thought about that. So let's say Zahari did all this stuff, pointed the plane south, took a cyanide pill. If he would have taken his hands off the wheel, would the plane have just kept going and glided down, or could he have just set the autopilot to go and then it would have crashed, or what would that have looked like? Because the general consensus is in the accepted theory that once it started heading south, it just went in a straight line.
That was the supposition at first. It turns out that that's not what happened. Okay. So we do have evidence that bears directly on this issue, and I want to go through it kind of carefully. Okay. But to make a long story short, it was not a ghost flight for the last 6 hours. But another point I want to make is that so what he did was complex as well as prolonged. And I was also interested in talking to the psychologist about the complexity part of it. Like, why would you, instead of just, like setting the autopilot altitude to 0 is like, it's a one-step process. Just
turn a dial or
you
something.
do that, then you sit back and you just wait for the end. You don't have to do anything. So I said to her, are there cases, is it known in the literature that people kill themselves in really complicated ways? Yeah. And she said, usually not, but sometimes. And she cited to me the case of a person who was an engineer. So it's not unknown. It seemed less unusual to her than simply the prolonging part. And that seemed really weird to her. But she said, you know what? People are unknowable at some level. People will do things that you just can't explain. You don't know what's going on.
Just because nobody has done it before doesn't mean it couldn't have happened for the first time. There's also a bunch of anonymous quotes, and I don't like anonymous quotes, and I bet you don't either. An anonymous friend of Zahari said this, and now I'm going to read this. It's a quote. He's one of the finest pilots around, and I'm no medical expert. But with all that was happening in his life, Zahari was probably in no state of mind to be flying. That's a big bomb to drop.
So this quote comes from the piece that William Langewiesche wrote in The Atlantic. And we might talk more about this article and how it came to be. But for now, I think it's important to unpack this a little bit, because Langewiesche basically talked to his friends at the NTSB, the National Transport Safety Bureau, and they said that the pilot did it. And he didn't really ask them why they thought that, but they had come to that conclusion. And so Langewiesche basically was, again, we talked about these two schools of thought. If you have already decided that Zahari is guilty, then everything that he does somehow implicates him. Even this in his own quote, this guy seems to say, There's nothing about Zahari's behavior or character that would lead me to be suspicious, but we know that he did it, so therefore he must have been in no condition to fly. It's absolutely circular reasoning.
I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. Am I missing something?
It's just a way to justify your beliefs beforehand.
Okay. But there are also supporting videos that Zahari was a pretty good guy. In the first two.
Well, so he himself had a YouTube page.
Yeah.
And he was putting up videos that he didn't have a huge number of them, but like it seemed like every time he would do like a home improvement project or DIY project, he would make a video and he would explain how to do the thing he was doing. And you could look at them, if you don't know if Zahari was guilty or not, you might look at them and think, okay, here's a guy who is a sort of handyman, tinkering around the house, like generally trying to be helpful, not a super self-aggrandizing guy, just kind of quietly helping out. Or you might look at them and see nefarious clues. And so these are real Rorschach tests. So I think it would be fun to look at them together and kind of just, talk about what we're seeing and see, how you could read it one way or the other.
Yeah, let's watch this one specifically about window repair. And we'll comment as we go. And I want the viewers and the listeners to tell us if they agree with us, because to me this does not look like a guy who's about to kill hundreds of people, including himself.
Okay, so we're watching a Zahari video called Window Seal. And so I guess he had a rental apartment, or he had a friend's apartment. I'm not exactly sure whose apartment this is, but his there's been a leak and it's caused damage. And so the point of this is to rectify this issue.
It's interesting. It's weird hearing his voice for the first time.
So this is not a guy who's making videos about how, demons are taking over the media. This is just the most low intensity, low psychological stress you can imagine. He's got a very mundane task, and he's going about it in a very methodical.
It's kind of peaceful.
Low emotion way. It's kind of peaceful, right?
This.
Which is not actually the best thing to do.
I mean, I think to be concerned with this kind of level of problem, you have to be attuned to your world. You have to be, you have to have the emotional space to deal with problems like this. He's not crushed by workload. He's not strung out, sleep deprived, hallucinating, hearing demons.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? He's living in a world in which he has relatively small problems, and he's dealing with them in a very rational way. So if we're looking at evidence that Zahari was mentally unstable, this is not that, in my estimation. However, I think what we should do is maybe fast forward it to a point.
Yeah. Okay, because there is a breadcrumb here, so I'm just going to scan forward here.
And I think this is why I wanted to look at this clip in particular, because what he does is, as anyone who's ever done a home painting job knows, you have to kind of put up. Let's pause it right here real quick. Some people looked at this, and rather than seeing a man calmly going about a rather mundane chore, saw evidence that he was trying to send a secret signal in these headlines. And you can quite clearly see the headline, "The End is Near for Twilight," and there's pictures of the actors from the movie Twilight. And then there's another one that says, "Bond drops by Afghanistan."
Okay.
And which is talking about a politician going to Afghanistan. And some people were like, okay, the end is near. That means he's sending a signal that he's going to kill a whole bunch of people.
This isn't the TV show Lost here.
Well, but I think it's worth knowing that this is the kind of thing that has happened in the case of MH370, where again, it's like you're seeing this evidence that you could read one way, or you could read it the other way.
I'm gonna look and see what the other newspapers say.
Probably wouldn't recommend you to do.
That one looks like it's about a bank.
Yeah, so maybe he was enraged about corruption, and there's like, it looks like a Sudoku or something. Maybe he was like he's signaling that he's leaving behind a puzzle for investigators to solve. Um, and here are some headlines in Malay.
I don't know, Jeff.
So, I mean, I think each person can take from it what they will.
All right. I took from it as a pretty a pretty mundane video about how to fix a window seal.
I also see that myself, but we can't. It's very hard to convince people otherwise if that's their mindset.
There are other videos about Zahari. There's one from his sister, and there's one from his niece, I believe. And the sister one is quite sweet and sad.
It's impossible that it's him. We are left suspended mid-air. All kinds of speculations. And for now, I would consider like I have lost my brother. But to make matters worse, fingers are pointing at him.
And the niece one is also quite sad because it's one of those sort of in memorial retrospects. And what I found interesting is there are a ton of photos of Zahari that look nothing like this shadowy, bald man that are the two photos that I've seen over and over again. Let's watch these.
So I think it's worth noting that the family members and loved ones of everyone on board this plane had tremendous pain to deal with after MH370 disappeared. I think it's a different kind of pain and suffering than just losing a loved one in a plane crash. There's a certain, quality of not knowing that I think must really eat at you. But for Zahari's loved ones, there was this extra element, which is that he was widely described as the murderer of everyone else's loved ones. And so, to lose somebody, but also to have their memory so besmirched, I think is, frankly, unimaginable to me. But I think it deserves acknowledgement that this guy really is innocent until proven guilty. And when we have so little to go on, really, this guy was basically judged a mass murderer based on mathematical deduction.
Not just mathematical deduction. The mathematical deduction is what said the plane went here and crashed. The mathematical deduction didn't say he did it.
Well, it did in the sense that to turn a plane around in a couple of seconds, about a minute before he said goodnight, Malaysia 370, then the plane is going dark and turning around. There wasn't enough time for hijackers to storm the cockpit or anything like that. So when I say that he was found guilty by just math alone, it was math that said that the plane went south, and other circumstances indicated that only really he could have done it.
Yeah, yes and no. And I'm not just going to add to our conspiracy theory here, but the thing is, we don't know what was happening on a personal level inside this plane. For all we know, there was a guy holding him at gunpoint saying, "Say goodnight, MH370," and then told him to turn the plane. We have no idea. We didn't hear any distress calls, but. There's just, I don't know. I'm not saying he didn't do it.
Well, listen, that's what this podcast is about, right? It's about kind of sifting through the evidence.
I'm not saying he did it or he didn't do it, but you're right, this is a huge accusation to level on someone that the best reason that they could call him a murderer is because the plane did a thing. I don't like it.
Right.
And I don't like that it's based on these anonymous quotes and flight simulator data, which we'll talk about a little bit. I heard very few breadcrumbs that would have led or hints to this. The only thing I read was he was having marital problems, and he might have had an issue with a mistress. I mean, has that even been corroborated?
To my knowledge, it has not been corroborated. All of the claims about marital discord and so forth are sourced to anonymous sources and have been refuted by his relatives on the record. So it's fairly weak tea in my estimate.
So we're trusting the criminal justice system of Malaysia here.
I can't characterize the quality of Malaysian police, but I will say that the official position of the Malaysian police is that Zahari didn't do it. So when the Malaysian authorities put out their report, they said, we looked at this guy, nothing is suspicious, there's no reason to think he did it. So from an official perspective, he was not blamed for this. Other people like Langavisha had done a piece about an earlier murder-suicide crash involving Egypt Air, where the Egyptian authorities were like, this guy's Egyptian, he's good. Yeah. And the Americans were like, this guy, we have him on the cockpit voice recorder, like saying, he's struggling for the controls, and it really looks like he fought in the cockpit and gained control of the plane and flew it into the ocean.
And airlines typically do sort of defend their own. I mean, they frequently say like, oh, couldn't have been our guy. I mean, that's not a position, and the unions. I mean, so they tend to defend the pilot before they go that route. But
people who are suspicious of Zahari anyway look at the official conclusion by Malaysian authorities and say, yeah, they're just covering their asses. They're just going to bat for their own. So, that does happen, but it's if we're looking for proof, if we're looking for hard evidence that Zahari was mentally unstable, that he was being pushed to the edge by debt or unhappy marriage, or that he was a jihadist or anything, you're really not going to find any hard evidence. They just didn't find it. They didn't find anything that painted this guy as a likely culprit. The one piece of evidence that they found was the flight simulator in his basement and the data that was stored on it. And we're going to save that for a future episode, but I just want to cue people to the idea that this was the one piece of evidence tied directly to Zahari that could be a smoking gun.
What do you want to talk about in episode 10, Jeff?
Well, episode 10, I think, is going to be a big one, and I'm pretty excited about it. In the episodes to date, we've been talking about why the authorities believe that the airplane must have gone into the southern Indian Ocean and how I came to agree with and understand their logic. But as time went by, troubling pieces of information began to accumulate and led me to doubt if there might be another explanation for what happened. And that's going to be, I think, a very interesting one, potentially controversial, but I'm excited to talk about it.